I invite Mr. Nabar to please carry on with his presentation.
Hi, everyone. So, just by way of background, our center focuses on economics of innovation and essentially been established to really raise the profile of research and development and technical capability in India's economic development. And the presentation today really looks at the research and innovation landscape in India. And higher education is clearly one of the key pillars in that system. So while you know, I'm going to focus some aspects of where the government spends and how they've been spending research, and there's a study that we have done on that. Um, want to make a case for why we need to have a lot more funding being shifted into higher education, because one of the key outputs from higher education is the kind of talent that could emerge from there. So, based on that study, and then some other data that we also look at in terms of, we've looked at some defense startups and technology-led startups in space and defense to then analyze, where are their founder profiles and some interesting findings in terms of founders who are coming from the non-IIT, ISER, non-top ranked NIRF institutions. So we'll showcase some of that too, and then finally end with some policy initiatives that are underway. I mentioned the NRF bill, right at the start, but in the earlier discussion, but then also some other supporting policy initiatives that are there. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's the NIS looking at the system here, and just put up something on UDCT Mumbai mentioned about the role of higher education. It's one of the premier institutes for research, and you can see that apart from the contributions to research publications, the graduates who've emerged from here have been really pillars of the pharmaceutical and chemical industry in India. So the one of the key things for us is really to say, okay, the output from higher education institutions have that potential to really lead the way in a number of sectors. So, yep. It's going to be quite data heavy, so I hope you don't mind. This is the spending on national research and development across several countries that we track. India, it's spends about 0.6% on GDP. This number has been stagnant for about, okay, GDP has grown over the last 30, 40 years, but this number has really been fairly stable in that range of 0.6% to 0.8% for almost 3 to 4 decades. When you look at the share of spending, it's largely the government sector. India is really an outlier here because industry, Ankur was also saying, and we were discussing earlier, that we don't do enough. That's one aspect of it. But it's also the government which spends, and where it spends is important. So very little actually going to higher education, more going into several autonomous R&D institutions which are completely cut off from the higher education departments and institutes. You can see that in countries like UK or even in the US, it's 15% that's performed in higher education, and this is largely coming from public funded R&D. So that's just to give some context. Some of the key scientific agencies, which again in the NEP were mentioned, where bulk of the spending happens. The first three are strategic industries, so defense, space, atomic energy. They account for about 50% of central government spending on research and development. The others account for the balance, and together they account for about 80% of the central government spending on research and development. As you can see, the Department of Biotechnology and ICMR, they're spending very little, and as a share of the central government spending on R&D, it's really it's hardly 6%. So where we've talked about education, I just want to bring in here that clearly we're not spending enough on critical things that need to be focused on. Yep. This is a study that we did with the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, CII. We analyzed about 200 public funded research laboratories. There were 193 covering about 232 institutions. These did not include the strategic ministries that I mentioned, so space, defense, and atomic energy, but the others, so the Council for Scientific Industrial Research, to ICMR, the Indian Council for Medical Research, and the Indian Council for Agricultural Research, and others. So the labs accounted for about 12,900 crores in terms of their budgets. If you take out the exclude all the strategic spending, then this is 12,000 of the 27,000 that was roughly analyzed. We looked at several criteria on academic, collaborations, publication output, patent filings, the earnings from commercialization, because clearly, you want a return on the kind of investment that's happening. And a lot of this data really makes a very strong case that we need to have much more movement of that funding, either through collaborations or opening up of these institutions to higher education, as a case to be linked very closely to higher education. So to give you an example, the academic projects, there were about 12,900 that were being undertaken in 2019-20, of which just about 14%, median share of projects across the institutions were academically linked. So, these are working in silos, but targeting sort of government-related sort of projects, and many of them are doing fantastic work. So it's not to take away from some of the laboratories that are working in communities to develop agricultural solutions for coastal regions and things like that. So it's not like nothing is happening, but the bulk of it does suggest that we need to now rethink and transform public research in a way that it really feeds better into higher education. So some of the sort of suggestions, how do you enrich the pool of not just scientific talent, but the talent in the country more broadly? There have been examples in transformations seen in France, the Chinese Academy of Sciences in China, the CSIRO in Australia, where many of these institutes actually either became part of educational institutions or co-located there. And it was mandatory for many of these researchers who would be doing some form of research to be also involved in the teaching. As I mentioned, in the very first slide, the output that we should really look for is the kind of talent that can emerge. So if they are working on research-related questions, then the hope is that it builds those kind of skills that are needed for the 21st century. The other aspects of it is how do you fund this, in a more competitive way, so that today it's not just completely allocated to the public research institutions, but also more funds available for competitive bidding from higher education institutions. That's partly what the NRF bill is also intended to do. But again, it's if you compare it to systems in the US and others where there's peer-reviewed review of the funding proposals, there are thousands of people reviewing those proposals. So I think some of the challenges which all of you have mentioned yesterday, it applies in several sectors. Not enough people to undertake patent searches, or it's there across the board. So, or even peer reviewed. Yeah, the other thing really is about opening up these facilities. Now, the recent budget announcement had an announcement saying the ICMR, so Indian Council of Medical Research facilities, would be open to public research institutions, other higher education institutions. This is one way to really encourage. And again, I mean, not getting into the bureaucratic issues of how easy it may be to access it, but we should push in that direction, that these are public funded institutions with that equipment does not belong to that researcher alone. How do we make it more accessible to the bulk of our population and students? So that's something which, in fact, with the government of Punjab, we did a project to really map out their science, technology, innovation, landscape by looking and bringing together the agricultural institutions, their public laboratories, their technical institutes, and saying, okay, how do we ensure that there's the potential to, share like equipment, resources in a more meaningful way, which can benefit the challenges that the state may be grappling with. So these are some initiatives which are underway. Yeah. Wanted to highlight some publications data. Uh, there are obviously question marks about journals. You would have read that, some there's a craze for publication, so we end up publishing in journals which may not be of a certain quality. Of course, that reflects even in, the impact factor. So we don't really have the kind of impact that, several other countries may be having in some of these areas. But the idea to highlight this is the kind of research that's being undertaken in our institutions, right? And as I mentioned, that bulk of the funding is going towards the public laboratories, but the output in terms of publications, 85% or more is coming from the higher education sector, right? So there's a skew in terms of output. Again, quality aside, but these are areas which are very critical to technology development of the future. So, the areas of whether it's electronics or multidisciplinary material science, like I mentioned, computer AI, things which I think are being done in our higher education institutions. I'm sure that, there are ways to rectify on the quality front, but also ensure more funding is allocated to these institutions. And the idea of ramping up investment in basic research in these institutions is really that, as I mentioned, keep bringing out the fact that it's creating a pipeline of talent for the future. So that's really the key here. Again, in terms of collaborations with industry, we brought it up earlier. Very little happening with industry. It's probably one of the lowest in compared to the world average. You can see there's a column which says industry collaborations. Very little that is happening across sectors compared to the global average. Some key institutions where that publish most of these research now, of course, the public laboratories, like I mentioned. You take CSIR or the agricultural research, or even the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. If you exclude these, most of them you'll see are all the top IITs that are doing the research. Of course, these account for just about 30% of total publications. So there is research happening elsewhere also. But it's the question is, how do you ensure that it's done in a fair manner where funding is allocated in a competitive way? It's a challenge, right? It shouldn't be just throwing money at institutions saying here's research funding and use it. But that's where the challenges are going to come from. Like, you have this new National Research Foundation, but how are you going to allocate it effectively? The reason I brought up the India-Israel, in the box below there, just to highlight that India actually is one of the leading destinations for multinational research centers. So many global multinational R&D centers have a presence in India, but very little connect with higher education. In Israel, these technology development centers, 85% of their funding, they give it to the institutes there. Of course, there are a smaller number of institutes, but the idea is that there is a flow of knowledge, flow of exchange of ideas, and key technologies that are being done in India. I mean, it's not that this research may be application oriented, it may be something being done for the local markets, but there's huge potential there to tap into these. So if you look at the patenting output of many of these multinational R&D centers, you'll find that they're in sectors where we don't really have a global presence, technology, hardware, electronics. So how can we, and this is one of the things which came up even in our innovation policy, the science technology innovation policy of draft policy, of how do you engineer spillovers to the higher education sector. So we have the building blocks. It's just about getting the systems right and making the connects and ensuring the positive spillovers. Some data that we've looked at, in terms of the STEM workforce, and we actually come out with a publication every 2 years, which looks at technology innovation in India. So this is from one of the essays in there. And this is graduate degrees awarded in the STEM fields. And you can see that, in certain fields like science, there's gender parity. In maybe IT and computer science, actually, you know, perhaps more women who are being awarded degrees in technology and engineering still catch up, like it's about 30%. But then what happens in the workforce after that? If we're looking at it from an innovation standpoint, it's really the inclusivity that I know we talked about it in the context of caste yesterday, but also I think in terms of gender, these are very important questions that we need to look at as people involved in policy. Next slide. Yeah, I don't want to go into details here of the case study. We looked at about 300 startups that have emerged from India in defense and space, and we looked at specifically those startups that have very specific linkages to industry in defense. It is very complex, to do defense-related research, and of course come up with technologies, and it's not easily taken up by the armed forces either. But the connect is there through awards or funding that they've received, and then we looked at founder profiles, and where are these founders emerging from. So it's just a list of all the technology startups, basically the areas of drones and space tech. So we looked at drones and space because they're a little more complex, and to look at where are they emerging from. Yeah, I can go to the next slide. The 157 startups that were looked at, you find that the bachelors of the 245 founders for whom we had data, 147 are from either an institute of national importance. So institute of national importance being either IIT, IISER, they're recognized by the government, or the top ranked institutions. Now people may question the ranking framework, all of that, but we have to use some starting point to say, okay, if these are the quality institutions, then and it's interesting. You have founders coming from Sangli, from Gorakhpur, from Dibrugarh, places where I think we really need to kind of reach out and see how can we encourage this talent pipeline to continuously flow. So how can we allocate more funding? I'm not saying like a helicopter just drop money everywhere, but I think we need to dig deeper and see where are these ideas emerging from and really encourage them. So, just to wrap up, some policy initiatives. I mentioned the National Research Foundation Bill, the opening up of the ICMR laboratories, which is very, very critical. 2 years ago, the budget also had, about 25% of their allocation of their funding. Now, defense is almost 20,000 crores. So if you take 25% of that being allocated towards private industry and higher education, there are question marks about what that 25% constitutes. But it's something very, very important that like this funding starts moving in the direction of higher education. Now, these are announcements. We have to still see like implementation and make sure that it's being worked on. A few years ago, we had one of the most generous incentives for research and development in the country for industry. There was no evaluation. It was taken away systematically, saying that, look, it's not being utilized properly or just a few were benefiting from it. I think when we talk about evaluation, these are kind of projects that also need to be looked at, like what is the return on this kind of investment? And there's a huge debate about, public funded. If you look at several companies in the West, they have benefited from technologies that were developed from public funding. So even Apple and Google and all these guys. So how do you, as a public whose taxpayer money has gone into it, also get some return on investment is something which we need to look at. And I think there's no better return than actually putting it possibly in higher education, because it's the talent that you create. There are certain new sort of initiatives around city knowledge clusters where you get people, laboratories, higher education institutions, industry together to tackle challenges, which I think can rope in several school students into these kind of projects and higher education students, but more importantly, just educating students about big data from, it could be just relating it to the environment, right? Or healthcare, like, just issues around that we'd seen in the pandemic and things. And lastly, there's an amendment in the CSR Spending Act where, you can now fund public higher education institutions and public research institutions. As we said, industry does not spend enough. But if these initiatives are taken up, while I've put this as, clearly my focus is on the STI ecosystem, but we can do it for humanities. We know that the humanities also, need a lot of funding. Studies have shown that the people who have been able to adapt and are more resilient post-pandemic are those who've had some background in humanities. So I think the multidisciplinary aspects of what we're trying to achieve, we need to ensure that there's funding given to all sectors. So it's just to draw in the CSR. Hopefully, this is something which, government spending into higher education, but also how do you attract private funding into higher education? That's it from me. Just some data, but that's
Okay, because both of you are outstanding examples of what good relevant research can do, and what it cannot do. All right, and the cannot I'll come to little later. The issue, as far as is that I think, for instance, every state, Rashmi, it's the thing, every state needs the kind of analysis that you did for the administrative and academic structures that are there. And all NGOs who are working in the field of education should really understand what they are doing, because and it becomes much more important because NGOs are now working much more in collaboration with the government and are going to scale and all of that. And so we who are in the NGO sector need really to understand what are the issues, how does the government academic and administrative structure both function at both levels, what it's supposed to do and what it actually does, and where are the gaps, etc. This question to you, Rashmi, simply is, I'm sure you discussed this, your study with the Andhra Pradesh government and Rajasthan. What happened to the study after, what happened to it in terms of changes which took place? You mean so the only beneficiaries are those who have listened to you or read your work?
I must say, I didn't do a very good job of sharing it with them. There were some issues I had because some of the things I couldn't share with them. So one is that, and the second thing is these are also very political things. And you, for instance, these changes. First of all, there is no vote to be got from getting a better SCRT or getting a better administration. Very little political motivation. And also, as I said, one person, generally people that don't enough work on our public have a kind of body of work says something. But also my fault, yeah. And Subir will tell you how many years.
Just ask.
Yes.
So, no, yesterday, Rashmi, you were not there, and I thought I was painting a grim picture of the situation, but you made it grimmer, I think. So, the tragedy is that apparently no country makes it to becoming a developed country without high quality secondary education. That really is sort of issue for us. I remember that in the 90s and early 2000s, not only were studies done, but several efforts made to develop SCRTs, CMATs, diets. I remember not seriously, we allocated 3 crore rupees to each CMAT, etc. Yeah, correct. But so, correct. We have diets with a peon and a principal. Yeah. So it really is an issue, outsourced.
Very much into
Completely, yeah. So
Is there a rank? There must be a ranking, right, of states?
we are a little far away from there. There's a 0-1, which is it's there or not there. So it's not. Yeah, and so it really is. Yesterday, we were worried about the fact that there are vacancies, but there are not even institutions. So that itself is a very big issue. And this is not to say that there have not been studies or there have not been allocations of money or efforts undertaken. But the situation seems to be a little worse at the secondary level than the elementary. But do you think it could also be that there are more private schools in secondary than government ones? And is that the reason for the government institutions not to be as strong? That is one thing. And the other, I mean, as an administrator, do you feel that a separate cadre looking at secondary and higher secondary would be better? As of now, it's sort of missing. And, elementary school inspectors or CRCs, BRCs, diets, they cannot really do anything. So do you think a separate cadre would help?
Your first question was about the. I don't know. I could be, but also see. See, the elementary story was different. At that time, India had signed some kind of agreement that we will make elementary education universal. Then this right to education bill also followed, and there was a lot of kind of pressure from everywhere, everything. That pressure has never been created in secondary education for whatever reason. See, I don't think for instance, external agencies are very interested that we upgrade our secondary education because we've become competitors of sorts, at least in the skill this. And we don't have the brains to do anything about secondary education. And the people who matter go to private schools. Everything is sorted. Separate. I don't think that's. I think you have a decent institution, give them a mandate. Why do you want to have hundreds of institutions? Your problem is basic. You don't staff and you don't give them a mandate.
I'd initially thought of asking that is there a way to have some indicators to rate the performance of any institution, but I think that's too far a question. Yes, like yesterday we were saying innovation starts after basics are in place. If there are no people, no institutions, no functioning.
But only if you question, will the work start somewhere. So it's good that we are questioning and discussing.